Hi, my name is Mícheál Halpin, and with zero experience in bike building and only minimal experience in bike maintenance, I recently undertook a project to convert a 1990s mountain bike into something very akin to a gravel bike. In this second video, I'm going to go through stripping some of the parts off the bike, but also some of the lessons I learned in stripping the paint off, including things that didn't work, things that worked pretty well, and things that worked really well.
Okay, so first up, I'm just going to talk through removing some of the parts from the bike itself. It's pretty straightforward for the most part. Obviously, being a 30-year-old bike, there was a few pieces that were stuck. The seat post in particular was basically crammed in there. Knowing I was going to actually take it out, for a few weeks beforehand, but once a day, I did add in some WD-40 down the seat post just to try and loosen it out long term. But ultimately, to get the seat post out, I actually had to put the saddle in a vise, a bench vise, and then using the entire frame as a lever, I basically had to eventually just kind of turn it out of there so it loosened out and came out that way. So without that, it probably wouldn't have come out, or at least it would have taken a lot longer. Removing things like cables, taking off the bottom bracket, they were all pretty straightforward. Again, when removing the cranks from the bottom bracket, even with the Part Tools crank puller tool, I did have issues. It did stick, and I actually had to do it a few times. So taking off the drive side, for some reason it just didn't move the first few times. Eventually, I took off the non-drive side, came back to the other one, and I eventually got it off. I did end up cutting my hand, my forearm a bit on the some of the teeth, taking it off, but eventually I managed to get it to shift. So everything else was pretty straightforward. Again, having a good cable cutter has helped a lot. I also purchased a set of cone spanners from Wiggle before I started, and those were very useful, both for things again like the bottom bracket, um, as well as for removing things like the headset. So regular spanners just were too narrow or too wide. So the cone spanners really helped. But other than that, then it was just standard tools like at various size Allen keys, 5, 6 mil Allen keys, and so on to remove everything else. You can see on screen this is the bike pretty much stripped down. So to get it to this stage, it probably took me maybe an hour and a half. And before I decided to do anything else with the bike, I did at this stage do a few test fits. So I did take things like the uh, the external bottom brackets that came off the original Tiagra group set. So I did do a quick test fit with those to make sure they would fit and that they were the right tread. Um, Turns out they were fine. They were just standard English tread bottom bracket, which I kind of assumed they would be. At this stage, before I decided to strip the bike back completely, I first decided to power wash it, just to get rid of any grease and stuff. I thought that would make stripping the paint long term a lot easier. And as I did start to strip it, I realized that some of the decals were coming off. So instead of just spending a 5 minutes stripping the bike, I probably spent closer to 30 minutes with a power hose, just stripping the decals off. My thinking being at any stage where if I thought I was making progress with something, I would just keep going. Because even if the paint stripper would remove it later on, it may not or may cause issues. So if I thought I was making progress at one stage, then I'd switch over to do it here. Now, and you can see once I actually had the decals removed, the frame itself actually didn't look too bad from a color perspective. The black with that luminous green inside, it actually looked pretty tidy. But as you can see around the headset, there was just way too much rust. So I wouldn't have trusted the frame as it was. Some people said just leave it as it is, maybe lacquer it. there would be some bits missing, but it'd be a bit of character. But I was just so worried that the frame was actually rusted through, or there'd be damage around some of the lugs, so I did have to just strip it back completely. Which brings me to probably the bit that took the longest in the whole project, was actually trying to get the paint off. So the first thing I actually did, and I did try a few different techniques, was I used a Rust-Oleum, I think it's called green paint remover. So it's green in that it's, a little bit less hazardous than other paint strippers out there. I just happened to have a tin of it lying around, so I decided to just spray it on outside and see how it would work. And you can see here with this time lapse, probably over the space of 20 minutes, 20, 30 minutes outside, you can see just bubbling the paint off. If I was to do the whole project again, I would just have bought a few more tins of this and just tried to do as much as possible. But I only had one tin available. I emptied it using it. And it definitely got most of the paint off. But as we'll see in a few minutes, not everything came off. And one thing I didn't actually realize with this paint is it had quite a different texture when removing it. So what I mean by that is it didn't just flake off like normal, old dry paint would work. This was quite rubbery almost to try and remove. Um, Very unusual. We'll see in a couple of minutes here what this looks like. One of the reasons I did this outside is this stuff is pretty toxic. Even the green stuff is quite harsh. I found I was getting really bad headaches, even though this was fully outside in the garden. I'd be able to spray this. I'd have to hold my breath going within 5-10 feet of it, and then walking away again. I definitely could tell without any air protection that this was quite rough. So here we can see what the frame looks like after all of the paint has been stripped off, and it does just kind of strip off. You saw in the little clip there, the little time lapse. I was able to just take a little mini trowel, and once it had set in, I was able to just scrape it back. So we can see under it, there was a good bit of rust around. And also, while a lot of the paint came off, a lot of it didn't as well. So it came off quite patchy. If I was to guess, you're probably looking at maybe 60-70% of it came off, but that still left a lot all over the bike that didn't. Now, as you can see here, while it does look like a lot of surface rust, that's all it is. It's literally just surface rust. So once you were to sand this down, that's all. The bike looks perfect underneath. So looking around the frame, there was no cracks, no damage, so I was quite happy with it. But you can see here, the paint was still quite awkward to get off. Now I did have one or two ideas for this that I'm going to talk about in a second. Now what we can see here is I've obviously moved the bike indoors, and I've set up a little tarpaulin behind it just because my original plan at this stage was to sandblast the paint, which I'll talk about. But just to see what this looks like, if I grab this and start pulling it, it's like a plaster. It's like a rubbery plaster. It's just not coming off. You pull it, it sticks. Originally, I thought that once I had the bike some way, covered in paint remover, it would just flake off mechanically. But I soon figured out that it was going to need something a bit more. So what I actually came up with at this stage was a cheap sandblaster. This one is from Parkside, which I think is the German retailer Lidl. I picked it up. It runs off an air compressor, which you can see I've actually plugged in beside my door. Very useful for pumping up tires and stuff, for even spraying water off the bike. So I thought it'd be perfect for this job. Now in this video, I actually just turned off the audio. All you could really hear was the compressor. And if you're not familiar with sandblasting, basically what you do is you're shooting a continuous stream at high pressure of sand, and that's used to strip paint from various metals and so on. Very common, with restoring cars. Generally, much better quality equipment. Um, I had read one review about this, one or two on YouTube, this particular device, but I just couldn't get it to work properly. I had done some testing before and wasn't overly convinced. You can see I've basically all the protective gear on, even just wearing a hat to stop any sand, or it's not even really sand in this case. It's kind of uh, little grains that are used to blast it off. You could see me there actually testing it against tarp in the background. I could see the sand was coming out. I could see it hitting the ground, but I'm not sure, was it down to maybe the pressure in the air compressor, which I set it to the recommended settings, but it just wasn't stripping the paint like I expected. I really thought this would be, a very fast, very seamless way, especially with all the uh, tricky areas, to actually strip this off. But you can see I gave it a couple minutes and I just bailed. It just wasn't worth the effort. We can see that the actual chemical paint stripper was quite good. Um, Sandblasting, obviously a massive fail, but one thing I just decided to try, just so I wasn't wasting the complete day, and it turned out it's actually pretty reasonable, was using this little detail sander that I've normally just used on wood projects before, with a pretty gritty paper. I think this was like an 80 grit and maybe went up to 120 to try and strip this paint. And you can see here, it is actually starting to come off. Very slow, but you see these little strips here, that's actually working. Now, this was quite laborious. Just to, do a couple of inches here took maybe a minute. So to cover the whole bike took quite a while, but it was definitely a step in the right direction. If I was to give one tip or one recommendation for the entire project, this cheap €4 paint and rust removal disc that you just plug into a drill would be it. It was so fast, so simple. For 95% of the paint that had to come off the bike, this did it probably 2 or 3 times faster than the little detail sander. I'd still start off using the Rust-Oleum first. I'd just get a few more cans of it, and then if needed, use this disc. But this will now always, just live in the toolbox. So simple, highly recommend it. And here we can see just a few photos of the frame in progress. Um, this was probably 2 or 3 nights into it. The way I did it was probably just, go out to the shed for an hour or two at night, try and get a little bit done. You can see here on the down tube, it's starting to come up pretty well, and as well as on some of the chainsaws. Obviously, some of the finer bits, around some of the lugs and stuff, were just a bit trickier. I left those to last, but you definitely see progress here. So once I was able to see it, I knew if I kept persisting, it would be worth it in the end. Now here you can see again a lot more progress being made. Um, on the top here, just above the bosses for the water bottles, you can still see some of the paint that's been sanded down roughly with the sander. So I'd have to keep revisiting this over and over again. And by the end, even though I thought this was like 99.5% good, I could still see when the paint went on that the parts that weren't 100% had a few issues. So I knew I was going to prime it. I thought the primer would actually address a lot of this, but it just wasn't good enough. I probably spent the bulk of the project at this. And if I was to do it again, I'd have spent even more time. I would have got this to almost glass-like, if I could, even if I was down to using very fine steel wool and very fine sandpaper to brush this out. And here it is, the final finished frame, just ready for prime and paint. Hopefully you found some value in today's little video. Definitely I learned a lot doing it. And I wish I'd picked up some of these tips beforehand. But of course, with all these things, until you actually do it yourself, you're probably not going to fully pay attention. But again, if I was just to summarize, get the Rust-Oleum paint stripper, the green one, a few cans of that, that'll definitely make life so much easier. You know, maybe an hour sitting in that, you're going to get the vast majority of the paint off. That Draper paint and rust removal disc, you know, was a lifesaver, made a massive difference. And having little things like a small Dremel just to really tidy things up made all the difference in the end. So with that, thanks for watching the video. Thanks for sticking around this long. If you like it, please give it a thumbs up. And if you want to see more videos in the series, please don't forget to subscribe. Chat to you next time.